This is again an Edgeworth box, and there's a thick line that I've drawn, which I'm going to explain can be an offer curve for both agents when the initial endowment is in the lower right hand of the box. Usually when we draw offer curves, they cross once or twice or 3 times. In fact, it's the case that every price in a broad range of prices can be an equilibrium price, and then just by fiddling with that a little bit, little perturbations, and blowing up initial endowments, one has a very nice argument that with homothetic preferences, very nice preferences, it's possible to have, to make any excess demand function that you give me, let's not talk about the boundary conditions at the moment, be a excess demand function that comes from an economy. In other words, there are initial endowments and preferences which will give you those, excess demand function. So I'm actually not going to suffer through this with you. You can look at the paper that I wrote with Wayne Schaefer in the Handbook of Mathematical Economics that credits Andreu for the nice little expository idea. Andreu also did some of the very nicest and best work on what has to happen on the boundary and conditions so that you can make, subject to those boundary conditions, the object that you're given an excess demand function. I mean, of course, you have to have Walras law and homogeneity, but that's all you need. See, this is getting much more difficult. I mean, I'm really sorry to do this to you. So the point is that this can be done with nice homothetic preferences, the nicest preferences that you would draw on a board, and it really is not the case that unique equilibrium is in the cards. If there isn't unique equilibrium, then think of the status of the argument that I gave in the upper panel. If there wasn't a unique equilibrium originally, and I want to say that after this gift, welfare will go down, well, I have to say with reference to which equilibria I'm talking about. So it's much nicer to talk about the comparative statics of making a transfer or the kinds of things which we will be talking about if you're talking about worlds with unique equilibrium. I'm sorry. So we'll now take a step a little further to explaining what this result is. The theory of international trade, the real theory, the non-monetary theory, is carried out, much of it is carried out in what's called the Heckscher-Ohlin model. In the Heckscher-Ohlin model, there are 2 countries. There's production of 2 different outputs using 2 inputs. And production takes place according to a common technology. The big theorems that you prove in the Heckscher-Ohlin model and in the standard form of the Heckscher-Ohlin model, you assume that the only thing that's different between these countries is their endowment of factors of production. So the two countries have capital and labor. They may have different amounts of capital and labor, okay? One may have a lot of capital, little labor. The other might have a lot of labor, relatively little capital. They're going to trade on the basis of those differences in endowments. They're not going to trade on the basis of differences in technology because technologies are identical. In the standard form of Heckscher-Ohlin, they're not going to trade on the basis of differences in preferences because preferences are identical. I want to start by talking about the big theorems of international trade, and quickly, since I really want to hold this to 10 more minutes, I want to at least get a statement of the kind of theorem that interests me, the kinds of examples that are demonstrated. The big theorems are the Rib Shinsky Theorem. What Rib Shinsky did in an amazing paper, it was written, I think, 53 or 4 years ago. It was the only paper he ever wrote. He became a banker and was very successful, I should tell you. It's a great career, and he wrote one of the papers that cited it, as much as any paper there is. It's a remarkable paper. And the paper is lovely. It's a note. It's another thing that's beautiful about it. I think it's 6 pages long. And he said, look, folks, I want to consider a closed economy. People think of it as being a small economy trading, but if you read the paper, it's not what it's about. I want to consider a closed economy. There are 2 factors of production, capital and labor. There are 2 outputs. Think of them as food and clothing. And I want to do comparative statics in this world. I'll assume very nice production, constant returns to scale production, different technologies for the production of food than for the production of clothing. And I'm going to be interested, essentially one consumer. His pictures are all wrong, by the way. If you go back to the journal, you'll look at this and they're impossible. They're just wrong pictures. I don't know whether it was him or the person who drew them, but they're wrong pictures. So it's all done in terms of there being one representative consumer. And he says, look, I want to do the obvious comparative statics experiment. And the obvious comparative statics experiment, and we don't do very much of this in general equilibrium theory. I'm not a trade theorist. I'm an old general equilibrium theorist. Most natural comparative statics is let's change the amount of a factor of production that this country has. Let's change the amount of capital it has or the amount of labor that it has. And let's see how things change. What happens to the prices of outputs? What happens to the prices of inputs? What happens to the actual production of food and I chose food and clothing in the economy. Let's see what happens to welfare. Let's see what happens to the amount of different inputs that are used to produce the different outputs. But by the way, certainly all of the inputs going to be used up in this closed economy. Demand's equal to supply. Price not going to be equal to 0. And what he showed was that if one increased the amount of a factor, let's say labor, he showed strong things about what happened to prices, to outputs, and the welfare economics is fairly trivial. And these results, including what happens if prices don't change, if output prices don't change, are the cornerstone of the, it's what everybody learns in the real theory of trade. There's a very striking result about what happens. Let's see whether I have this. It's a very striking result at the bottom of the 3 drawings there about what happens. X we'll think of as food, Y we'll think of as clothing, L and K are labor and capital.